Okay, we're back at the Berkeley Buddhist Monastery doing the 9th chapter of the Avatamsaka Sutra. We're finishing up the first series of verses, chapter 9, Luminous Awakening. There's two verses left here. We touched on one last week, and then we'll move into the other one tonight. Have you been keeping notes on working with the translation a little bit? No. Yeah, great. Because this is very, very stiff. That verse says, living beings, wu or sheng, basically not existing or not born, or literally the language you produced, also without extinction or gone, neither come nor gone.
Neither come nor go.
How's that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Neither come nor go, or never born or leave.
And then this is presented in the third line as a kind of wisdom. In other words, it's presented to us not as a far-out hypothesis, but actually what one sees with full awakening, or even sometimes a partial awakening. We can start to see these hard and fast boundaries between life and death starting to disappear or merge. And they're only kept up by a sort of cognitive paradigm we get locked into. It takes a lot of effort to keep that up. So the third line then suggests that when one relaxes attachments and confused thinking, and wisdom naturally starts to manifest, take over, this is what we see. We see that this is not the way it is. And then upon seeing that, it indicates further, basically, that we can go forward and realize or complete walking the path. So there's a sequence here that has to do with seeing things as they really are, which then in turn, which results from letting go of attachments and confused thinking, which then further diminishes those, and therefore there's no impediments. This is somewhat like the Heart Sutra when it says Bodhisattva Avalokiteshvara saw the emptiness of phenomena and left behind all suffering and difficulty. So the difficulties then, the accomplishing the way, opens up as a result of this. So in a sense, it's not that one accomplishes the way through muscling one's way through, or just sheer willpower, or sort of passively waiting. It's some combination of, again, the Heart Sutra, of profoundly contemplating, cultivating direct insight into things through Shila, Samadhi, and Prajna. And so it's actually a seeing, a result of seeing things as they are, not a believing per se, even though you can start with that. It's confirmed through direct experience. So now it's moved from believing to direct knowledge. And nor is it given to one, bestowed from without. It's coming from seeing this for oneself. So this is how this verse works. And then the last verse, maybe we'll get to, we'll read it tonight, and then see if we can get to it in some discussion. Yizhong, it says, Jewu, my pronunciation, Liang, fourth tone, Liang, okay, Wu Liang, Zhong Jie Yi, Lao Bi Gan Sheng Qi, Dang Cheng Wu So Wei. Oh, it's the way, fourth tone, okay. Literally, in the midst or within, that which is without limit, without measure, within the limitless or the measureless, there's an E, there's a one. There's a oneness within the limitless, or a unifying principle or unifying phenomena that works through the myriad differences. And also it says within the limitless, there's the one. Literal. And we're trying to unpack this a little bit, hopefully. Liao is to understand or resolve, understanding this, that they mutually arise. This is very much like the idea of complementary nature. Without darkness, there's not light. Without light, there's not darkness. Without high, there's not low. These are complementary pairings. If one understands they mutually arise, then one will accomplish fearlessness. So what does fearlessness have to do with this? Again, it goes back to, I think, this theme of breaking through the false dichotomy of me and others, this world transcending, living beings and Buddhas. The fearlessness breaks down, interestingly, with the letting go. So it's not a fearlessness that comes, again, from building up something, so much it is letting go of basic notions, ideas, attachments to self and what belongs to a self. This is what the fearlessness partly is implying. Maybe to say a little more about the concept of living beings tonight, because it could seem counterintuitive to deny there's such a thing as birth and death. But actually, I want to present tonight that although the text we could say is a spiritual document, and certainly it's that, whatever one means by spiritual, it doesn't mean that the spiritual doesn't include the material, or what we might call a more scientific look. It's not for sure that the scientific includes the spiritual, but it's certainly the case that the spiritual can and does include scientific. A scientific is another way of using the mind to look at phenomena. It's an investigative tool. Buddhism is the study of the mind in all its states, and one of those states would be the systems of thought or disciplines we set up to look and analyze. So it's certainly within its purview, but it's not considered to be final or absolute. So if you look at it, say, from just kind of not so much a religious spiritual side from the scientific side, then the idea of birth and death, of hard and fixed categories, there's birth and then there's death, actually doesn't hold up very well. It doesn't correspond to at least my scientific training. You're all going, whoa, that's like ancient. It's true. I studied it a long time ago. I try to keep up on some things, but even when I studied it a long time ago, it seemed to me even at that time that these hard and fixed categories didn't really apply. There is only, if we can observe, and I'm using now empirically, from a self that's observing, all we can observe is continuous change and transformation. We do not see necessarily birth as a beginning. Where is it exactly does it begin? If you wanted to get into it, does it begin with leaving the womb, say, for a person? Does it begin in the womb? Does it begin at the moment of conception? Well, then does it begin before conception? But before conception, is there nothing? So there's a famous principle in philosophy, basically it's called ex nihilo nihil. And it basically means nothing comes from nothing. It means nothing comes from nothing. Everything comes from something. So this idea that these sort of categories we impose actually are a kind, from the Buddhist point of view, a kind of what is called wangshan, wrong thinking or wrong perception, wrong looking. It doesn't mean that it's necessarily morally wrong in that sense or bad. It means it's distorted, as if one had cataracts in the eyes, which is how the Shurangama actually talks about this avidya, this wombing, this lack of, and basically wombing means without light, without seeing, translated as in Chinese as ignorance, but it actually has to do with a misperception, a misapprehension of things as they are. And so that, what I'm trying to present tonight is to say, in fact, if you look at it more scientifically, it actually corresponds to the Avatamsaka here and what the text is saying. Not only the Avatamsaka, but even, I think, most of these texts. And so when the Vajra Sutra says the person who's cultivating, when they have a certain state of liberated seeing and knowing, then they see that there is no mark of self, no mark of others, no mark of a, sometimes called a life, or shung, the being here, and lifespan. And all of these, the mark, I mean, the characteristic or the demarcation, let's use this way, the actual interruption of continuous change and process transformation. When we mark it, we set up a boundary. That's what marking means. It's almost like graffiti. You have to think of it, I am marking, I'm in my mind separating this out into a distinct self-existing something or other. That's the mark. And so it says there's no mark of the self because the boundaries of what is self and not self actually are very fluid. And then if we look at it deeply, there is no such thing as we can call a self, a permanent, substantial, unchanging soul or essence. And the same as others had that. To demark others as having that is also not the case. And also this idea of a life, which the text is pointing to tonight as a very ambiguous term that we impose. If we mean by life a continuation of change and transformation, it's okay. But mostly what people means by life, it means to exist is to not change. Okay, existence is different than non-existence. Okay, exist is to be and not change, and non-existence is not being. And this is a very different notion. So if we use existence as, it's meant in this text as a continuous ongoing process of transformation and change, it's okay. But generally what people mean by existence, non-existence, or birth or death is here it is and here it's not. And I'm just saying that doesn't correspond to anything in reality that we can observe. So what the Vajra Sutra is saying, when there's no mark of self, others, lifespan, and life, and the span would then be, oh, there's a certain amount of years we have. But in fact, we know ex nihilo nihil, nothing comes from nothing. So before there was this moment of what we call birth, there was continuity of something. And after this point of death, there is also continuity of something. Materially, of course, ashes to ashes, dust to dust, it recirculates. So in any event, no matter how we stretch it, we cannot, in our ordinary, even pushed contemplative experience, find these boundaries. They don't apply. And yet, the fundamental quest for continued substantial self that's immortal, that's the dream state, that and the pursuit of all things that one loves and can't see through leads to this marking. And it's really interesting. So it doesn't really exist, but our quest for the substantial self that endures and all the things that we want and love and can't see through, this framing then leads to this marking. And so it's really critical because this teaching ties into the core teaching of not self or anatta. It ties into emptiness, and it ties into what it means to be liberated. So these are all woven together, and that's why the text will say, if you can see it in this way, you will realize the unsurpassed way. If you can't, you'll be clinging to an illusory state and locking yourself in a silo of conditioned existence, and you'll never get out of it. So the teaching becomes, there's nothing in the world that we can observe that has some unchanging essence, that isn't conditioned by other things. Nothing in our normal experience, nothing never changes. Now, I was mentioning last week, this was a beginning meditation that our teacher would give to us. When you meditate, contemplate and examine and investigate, what is it that doesn't change? And so you can look at the heavens and you realize, my gosh, it's this constant change going on up there. The sun itself, we say the sun is constant, but you get closer to it, it's one humongous gas and fiery. Whoa, it's like a continuous 4th of July element. You can't even get near enough to, so it's not like it's the stable sun. It is actually going through incredible, and then you go down the micro, you sit in meditation, sit quietly in meditation. You want to count your breath, whatever you're doing, it changes. Oh, no. Yeah, your breath changes. And you try to hold on to a breath, you think, that was a really good breath, I'm going to keep that one. it ain't going to work. Because something in the nature reality demands you let that air out and you bring the air in. It's different air that's coming in, and the air that goes out goes someplace. It doesn't just disappear. So this is really interesting. You just sit in meditation and just feel your pulse. If you're really quiet, you can hear the pulse in your eardrum, or you can feel your heart beating and realize, and everything's going to change, 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 love, dub, change, love, dub, change. It's not like it stops. And what you think is stillness is not a stopping. It's not attaching to. It's a not attached state. It's not a stopping. As soon as you attach, you try to stop, but you can't stop. So this is really a funny irony. So stillness is not the absence of change or the cessation of change. It is working right within the constant flux and yourself not attaching or grasping. It's a very different notion of stillness. That's why it says you cannot have stillness without movement, and you can't have movement without stillness. Again, they're non-dual. So this is probably the most basic point, I think, if we wanted to get down to the basics on the Buddhist teaching, was this observation that everything in our life changes, and our life itself is a changing phenomenon. It's not like everything in our life changes and here we are, unchanging core center. No, the very self that we think is observing the change is also a change. And none of us, well, I don't know of anybody who has any experience of anything unchanging. You know, someone's going to joke and say, oh, my bad habits are unchanging, they're constant. Okay, that you could say as a joke, but in fact, there was a time you didn't have those bad habits, and they're either getting less or they're getting greater. If you're not attending to them, they're getting greater, but they're not unchanging. Yeah. And you say, well, next life I'll change them, but if you're cultivating in this life your bad habits, actually by next life they'll really be pretty intense. They'll be really, you made a major investment. It's going to be hard to break the bank on that. So I'm saying the idea that generally people have is existence and non-existence, or existence and becoming, are perceived as opposite, because what we call existence is a false reification of change based on the ego that wants to stop things. Now, the other thing that's really important about this with living beings, and I mentioned this last week, lest we fall into despair and depression, that everything is impermanent, everything's changing, nothing's constant. Therefore, it seems like we're into a nihilistic void. But actually, and I would say primarily, I would say the negative idea of change, of anicca, as one of the three marks. There's impermanence, anicca, there's anatta, no self, there's dukkha, which is the unsatisfactoriness. Those three elements, they're all interrelated. They're all interrelated. Because everything is changing, and because there's not a permanent self, it leads to, from the paradigm paralysis of the self, a problem called dukkha. It's unsatisfactory. But let's pull back from that to see that they're all related. Then the question comes up, and I tried to bring this up last week. I think my view is the impermanence of everything is actually a much more profound gate of optimism and liberation than the opposite. Now, when it's contemplated as the opposite, it's only to break the attachment. That it's sort of like, there's me and I'm not changing, and I'm going to get what's not changing, and da-da-da. And someone's got to come in and say, wake up, come on, get real. That's not the case. So the contemplation of impermanence as a sort of, I don't know how you'd use it, sort of Shakespearean. He contemplates impermanence with a sort of sadness and a melancholy. Oh, my love will pass away too. Oh my, what is it that doesn't change? Oh, whoa. That is one part of the Buddhist teaching, but it's not the most important. I think the most important part is the positive side of change, which means you're not stuck and bound. You can transform. If that's not possible, if you're locked into an unchanging, there's no room for growth, which means you are what you are now. Well, some of you might say, that's not too bad. Maybe not. Maybe not. But I would think somehow if you're contemplating, you're really thinking things over, your prospects of growth and optimism and a future have to do with the dynamic and the truth of change. So the thing is, you can work with change in a positive way to actually direct and redestine yourself. or you can just let change happen. Either way, change is a constant. If you just let it happen, this is the unexamined life. This is a life that rolls around driven by habits and patterns of, unreflective examination. What Buddhism is trying to do is to get you to step into that stream and do a more directed, concentrated, thoughtful, or mindful approach to the change and say, how can I dynamically work with this? And that's where vows come in, that's where precepts come in, because what you're doing is you're changing your change. You're directing your change in a way that has an outcome. It's called going from akushala, which is unskillful change, to kushala, which is skillful change. So this becomes really critical. That's why I think this is primarily a fundamental process. And the Avatamsaka really, in a sense, is a huge book of changes. It's not the I Ching in the classical sense, but it's a huge description of the coming into being and the changes and transformations in this process of all beings and all worlds. And it's basically describing and giving a roadmap for how this change occurs. My teacher did a wonderful little short book essay that originally was entitled "The 10 Dharma Realms Are Not Beyond a Single Thought." Basically saying that all phenomenal paths of existence that we know come from, directed by, not random, but directed change. Now you can have directed change that's intentionally bad karma. It's still intentional change, but it's going into a direction that is even more replete with suffering and disappointment. You can direct it through vows and precepts to go in a different direction. But the change is a constant. The thing about the 10 Dharma realms is to say agency is not outside yourself. It's within your thought processes. He says in the text, a single thought. What he means there is in thought to thought, moment to moment, we have the freedom or the power to direct our change. And it's not wishful thinking. It's actually intentional, mindful action. So this idea then that change is random is not a Buddhist idea. It isn't random. It's actually either intentionally negative or intentionally directed. And I think probably this is the most important element here of this text, is it's describing how you can get a handle on taking charge of the change. This whole theme we're working in. And this is coming kind of intuitively as these bodhisattvas in these beings in this chapter have been cultivating, but it's also a boost they're giving from the light that's presented by the Buddha. So this is probably one theme I wanted to bring up tonight. It's a very important theme. And maybe people have questions or not. The other theme that I think comes up, and then we'll take a little break here, and I think Jinchuan is going to talk tonight. You can see these whole line of verses. There's a couple themes. Well, one theme that works through it really strongly is the theme of bu'ar, non-duality. And again, a lot of people have trouble grasping this, but if you look at what we've been talking about tonight, then you see birth and death are a non-duality. There's just a continuation. And the breaking down of those dualities, the mark of self, others, living life and life, also you dissolve those boundaries which actually don't exist, and by dissolving them, you see non-dual means continuous, interrelated, interchanging, and not distinctly separate. So if you see, I just quote some of the lines in the verses previously. One line says, if one can look upon the world with a mind that is unmoving, the unmoving mind means you don't leave the ground of this continuous view of observation. Unmoving means you do not set up those dualities. You don't fall into those dualities. And I say fall into them because they aren't there, but we fall into it in that we project that out. And we make something that is continuous, unchanging, interrelated, interconnected, a fabric, so to speak, into these distinct that don't exist. So that means when the mind moves, when we leave the mind that see things as they really are, and this is what the patriarch means by let the mind be unattached, clinging or moving onto nothing, then this just manifests. So that's one. One's mind is completely level and equal. That's another line from these verses above. If worldly and world transcending views are left far behind, the two thoughts do not manifest. So you see through all these verses a non-dual theme. And I'll just finish that again. I will try to express that some people say, oh my God, that Buddhist stuff is just like so far out metaphysical, like non-duality. It must be a mystical. It's not a mystical apprehension. It's actually just the way things are. I'm sorry, there's nothing, phenomenally magical or wondrous about non-duality. In fact, the opposite is true. When you have duality, that's what's really wondrous and weird, because it doesn't exist anywhere except in your imagination. I'm sorry. And imagination is kind of fun, but it's not a very great place to set up. Anyhow, so I'm going to suggest that just again, I'm going to share a little bit of my limited science. And of course, this is very limited. I'm sure it's gone beyond what I learned. But early on this idea of non-duality, I learned, I don't know, maybe this was physics. Where do you learn thermodynamics? Is it physics? So in my physics, which was pre-Newtonian. No, I was like, we had Newton then, okay. We didn't have quantum then, but we still had Newton and we had Einstein. And there's a thing of matter and energy, the conservation of matter and energy, which is one of the laws of thermodynamics, basically saying that nothing's created or destroyed, but simply undergoes change from matter to energy, energy back to matter. And so this states that if that's the case, then it's non-duality. Conservation of matter and energy is just another material expression of this large concept of non-duality. And so the way I learned it was humans themselves don't have the ability to create or destroy matter. They don't create or destroy it. They simply work with it. Okay, it's very different. They only, in a sense, rearrange matter and energy. So even you say, well, they created the atomic bomb. Well, they didn't create the atomic bomb. They merely rearranged the atoms that were pre-existing into a certain form that had this result. Okay, and then they destroyed with the atomic bomb. Well, they didn't actually destroy. They just changed atoms and molecules in another to something else. They didn't really understand what's going on here. It's like, was it destroyed? No, it was just changed. You say, well, yeah, but so an oxygen atom will cycle through a living system. This is my old. For example, I'm looking at photosynthesis. When a plant produces sugars or carbohydrates, the plant does this by using the energy of the sun. It doesn't create the energy. Okay? So the plant is not like creating, it's not a self-existing thing, an ego. Oh, even plants are anatta. Oh, sorry. Yeah, it's taking the energy from the sun and it takes molecules from the ground. It did not create the water. It takes some molecules. So it's taking the sun and the H2O and carbon dioxide. Where does it get that? It's delivered through Amazon. No. So the CO2 comes from the air. It didn't create. So it doesn't create the water, it doesn't create the energy, and doesn't create the carbon dioxide or the oxygen. And it rearranges all these molecules into something, that we call plant photosynthesis and whatnot, da-da-da-da-da. So this is a very simplistic sort of representation of a cycle of nature in which the plants produce food. Okay? Now, you could take it further. We eat the food. We didn't create the food. And we don't destroy the food. We just take the food in and we transform it in our system. Partly we use it to build some energy, which then is used to do other things. It then goes further and da-da-da. Some of it comes out the other end and it goes someplace else. And some of that goes on plants again and becomes nutrient for the plant. Very interesting, okay? So animals then take these plants like us, we're animals, and we use our respiration to break apart the sugars, the carbohydrates, produced by the plants by using oxygen, and we give off carbon dioxide as a waste product. Interesting. So everybody knows this. For example, trees like us because we give them carbon dioxide, and that's their chocolate. That's what they live on. They love carbon dioxide. We would die on carbon dioxide. So interestingly, not intentional, the trees give off Oxygen. Wow, what a nice relationship. So why are we cutting down all these trees? Stupid. Really? You think about it, we're cutting down our lung support. And I have a feeling, this is not scientific per se, but the virus that we're dealing with right now that hits the lungs, to some extent in a larger causality system, has to do with our messing up of the natural cycle of lung supply back and forth. And the more we destroy the mechanisms of this living planet, of which we're mutually interrelated with, the more, in fact, from a non-dual perspective, we are harming ourselves and harming others. And conversely, the Bodhisattva says, by benefiting yourselves, we benefit others. So this is a model that you can move from that. So around and around it goes, matter and energy not being created, not destroyed. And this also then suggests that the law of karma, this intentional action transforming, rearranges things. Ooh, wait a minute. So what you're working with karma is you're not creating something, but you're rearranging, you're changing something. The merit and virtue doesn't come ex nihilo. It is a transformation of your basic substance. That's why it says Fannao Joshir Puti. Afflictions and bodhi are on a non-dual continuum. In a sense, they say ice and water. So your afflictions are this matter, ice, and when transformed through compassion and insight and wisdom, it becomes bodhi, water. One is not created, one is not destroyed. It is actually a transformation. Really important to understand. Because then if we understand, if the nature is whole and complete and has everything, then it's a matter of working with the transformations of that nature and not saying, I need to go out and create merit and virtue. What you need to do is stop creating offenses, and merit and virtue will naturally come up from that. I once asked my teacher, how can I get virtue? And he said, don't worry about getting it, worry about losing it, because you naturally have it. I said, well, then how do I lose it? He says, you lose it through greed, through fighting and seeking and always wanting me, self-benefit and lying and so forth. If you don't do those, virtue naturally stays whole and complete. So it's really important to understand this. That's why you have no seeking in this teaching. All you're trying to do is correct and transform yourself positively. And by doing that, energy, matter, if you want to say afflictions and bodhi themselves, transform. And I want to say the other side of this too, because just as you can create or rearrange and bring to more full expression and use this natural storehouse we have of virtue and merit and insight, you can squander it too. You can go the opposite way. And by not attending to it, it transforms into something else called afflictions for yourself and others. And that's why, in this sense, the thing about, say, karma that has to do, let's just take something like killing. We have, in a dualistic sense, this notion of me and my enemies. And if I kill my enemies, I get rid of them. No. In the conservation of matter and energy, and in a non-dual structure, all you're doing is changing something. You've changed that living being into another form of energy that then returns in terms of consequences of those that wish to harm and hurt you. So this law of karma actually is another statement of this conservation of matter and energy principle. And you have to think, in my actions of body and what I say and even what I think, I'm transforming matter and energy. In what direction am I transforming it? And what goes around indeed will come around in this model. So this is a kind of way to look at it, as not mystifying it or making it metaphysical. So that's where I'll stop tonight and invite Jin Tuan to come up. And then we'll go into the next verse next week on the one and the many.
Good evening, everyone. So Marty was talking about this passage
that living beings are without production. And I would try to do a new rendering of it because I think production is not a word we usually think about. So here's my attempt to translate this verse. It goes, living beings are free of birth and also are free of decline or passing away. With this wisdom, you will realize the unsurpassed way. And I thought to use the word you is nice because it kind of makes it much more existential, like it's talking to us. This is how we can actually realize this unsurpassed way. And it's interesting when Marty was talking about how we designate a kind of place of birth or mark something as a birth and mark a place of death. In a certain way, it's kind of arbitrary. And I thought of something that we had a retreat at Sudana Center. This was led by Dharma Master Heng Sure and Doug. And we were studying Nagarjuna Bodhisattva and Irigare, who is a feminist philosopher. And we were reading a book by her. It's called Forgetting Air. And she was responding to Martin Heidegger. And to kind of simplify it, her main insight, which really struck me, was that there's a big divide in the Western mind between men and women. And it's because men have forgotten that they actually came from a woman. We were actually born from a body of a woman. There's like a deep connection there. So we have to remember that connection to be able to heal this relationship. And the reason it was so striking to me is she described this process of a human being in the mother's womb and this exchange of energy and fluids and things, and then being born. And I've never really thought about that before in my life, about this physical body of mine actually came from my mother's body. At one point, it was actually my mom's body, And if you really look at this, her body at that point was her mother's body, going back and back and back and back. And if we look at this principle about at what point can you say, is my body actually born? Was it born the moment there was something in my mom's womb? Or was her body still part of something in the process of something? And her body going back, 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 and back, right? And this is a very interesting contemplation to me to realize that this thing that I take kind of for granted actually has a very deep history, a very profound history. And if we look at the Buddha's kind of vision, kind of connecting a little bit to the next paragraph or next verse, talking about one in the limitless, is that from the Buddha's perspective, all living beings have been our parents, our mothers and fathers. This is talked about in the Pali Canon, actually. There's a sutta that talks about that, called the Mother Sutta. And in the Brahmanet Sutra, it talks about how all living beings have been my parents, my mother and father. So if we look at that way, all those who are listening to me, Marty, Jingwei Shi sitting here, you've all been my parents. And in a certain sense, maybe I've been your parents. And there's this very deep interconnection that you could say is happening at a physical level, just our physical bodies. But then if you look at a consciousness level, there's a mutual influence of consciousness that's happening all the time. So I thought as a really interesting way to look at this idea of not living beings are without this birth and without this passing away. Because when you really look at this situation, like what Marty was describing, you can't just say, okay, this moment is birth. When the person comes out of the mom's womb, I define that as birth. Like, okay, well, how about when you were a baby in your mom's stomach? Were you born at that time? Well, how about your mom just, existing? Was there a process of a birth there at some point? So if you just keep going back and back, I find it's really interesting. You can't really say, this is the moment when birth was happening. It's this process, and our mind just wants to, as Marty says, just demarcate something so we stop something somewhere. And that's actually not the profound wisdom of the unsurpassed way that's being described here. I was going to tell a story about this idea of fearlessness, and it connects with this idea of letting go that Marty just talked about. And so maybe I'll just say this story. It's a bit connected to the limitless and one, but not directly. Actually, I'll tell another story, be much more directly related, and I'll save the other story for another time. Is actually the Buddha. And the Buddha at one point had his cousin who was named Devadatta, who was really, really had it out for the Buddha. He actually tried to kill the Buddha on many occasions. He sent a wild elephant charging the Buddha. He threw a boulder off a mountain. He sent a woman who pretended to be pregnant, saying that the Buddha got her pregnant, to slander the Buddha. Right? Just over and over again, he would try to harm the Buddha. But there was no fear. And if you read in the Lotus Sutra, which is really striking, that Devadatta, who spent so much of his energy trying to harm the Buddha, in the Lotus Sutra, the Buddha says, you know what? Devadatta is actually my spiritual teacher. It's like, what? And he will become a Buddha someday. So you read this section in the Lotus Sutra, that in the Buddha's eyes, he sees the limitless in the one of limitless. He sees this deep, profound interconnection, like what I was just talking about, how we've been our parents for limitless lives. We've been each other's teachers and students. We've been brothers and sisters. We've been friends, probably also maybe enemies at some point. This kind of interconnected web is happening. And if you have that kind of vision and wisdom, you can actually see there's no place to stop something and then be afraid to hold something back. It's just letting go and seeing all this interpenetrating reality. So it's clearly not my state, but reading the sutras, I can see how the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, when they kind of abide in this Avatamsaka reality where you don't solidify and reify this one thing here that tries to keep everything out and push it away and kind of get stronger and stronger inside and more hard. It's actually this letting go and opening to this constant flux and change, this interpenetration. So maybe I'll just say that much for tonight.
Very interesting what you've done with this. It's something we worked on with the Platform Sutra too. In other words, the translation that you gave, free from birth, free from death. This is the character is either a Wu, right?
Wu, right here, we got Wu.
Wu in Chinese has many meanings, but generally translated as without, lacking, nothing, absence, and so forth. But again, this is the problem with translating these terms into the West, let's say just to a modern mind, is they actually don't convey that. What they convey is liberation and fullness. Mm-hmm. So emptiness, in the Buddhist sense, is a positively powerful, liberating, expansive fullness thing. By saying free from, you change it away from lacking. Mm-hmm. So it's presented as there's a freedom from this demarcation, a freedom from this limitation, as opposed to you're being punished by no life and no death. And that's why I'm saying, even without commentary, which we obviously need, but good translation will open a door that isn't there if you just take it literally, from the dictionary, and you take it on time of a cultural mindset that's based on a dualistic frame. So there's two things, and by doing that, you moved out of that dualistic frame.
Honestly, I got that from the Sixth Patriarch Sutra. Exactly that point made a huge difference for me when I was reading the sutra, because before that, when we say no or without, it made no sense to me. I'm like, what's going on?
No thought.
Yeah, no thought. It's like,
thinking.
no thought.
Yeah.
So I just stop thinking. No appearance. Like, I don't see anything anymore. It's like, no, it's because our mind keeps trying to label things and hold on to things that is the problem.
So the unattached, liberated mind could be translated as no thought, no getting. But in effect, what it is no chains.
Yeah.
It's
free.
Who is it? Nothing hinders me. Pinocchio, when he loses his strings, it's like he's without strings. No, he's free to be a little boy. Remember, there was no strings on me. So the Wu has to do with a freedom rather than absence. One last thing I wanted to read with you, because you were talking about birth and so forth. So this is one of my favorite stories. This is Han Shan De Qing, and it's in the 1550s, so really around Shakespeare's time. And this is his recollection from 7 years old.
Oh, wow.
Wow. Chinese, that would make him what, 8?
I know. Yeah, 8.
Eight.
Well, but he's probably, if he's saying he's 7, then he's
It's
only
the 7th
6.
year.
Then he's 6 then.
He's 6.
He's 6.
Yeah,
in
I
our
was
time.
thinking this at 6 too. So he writes about his 6th year. When it was time for me to get an education, my parents sent me to a neighborhood school. Nothing philosophical occurred to me until one day when an uncle of mine died. Though I loved my uncle very much, I hadn't known he was even sick. And when I returned from school and found him stretched out so quietly on the bed, I didn't know what to think. My mother played a mind game trick on me. She said, "Your uncle is sleeping. You can wake him up." And I called and I shouted and tugged at my uncle trying to wake him up, but he wouldn't respond. My aunt wasn't amused. "What's wrong with you?" she snarled. "Can't you see he's gone?" I couldn't understand how he could be gone when he was still right there. My mother explained, "Your uncle is dead. His body is here, but his spirit is gone." And so I wondered where the spirit goes when the body dies. Soon after this, another aunt of mine gave birth to a boy. My mother and I went to visit them. When I saw the baby, I asked, "Where did this baby come from?" "He came from your aunt's belly," she answered. Now this was very mysterious. Very mysterious. And I asked, "How did he get into Auntie's belly?" My mother patted my face and said, "You silly boy. Where did you come from?" "From my belly." "Don't you know how you got into there?" And his last line is, "I didn't know how I managed to do that. And so I was really puzzled." This is what started me wondering about birth and death. And to be honest, I've never really understood it. So I share that from Hanshan. It's yeah, anyhow. Okay, we'll stop here for tonight. We'll do our transfer. Any announcements that need to be made?
Yeah, we have so we have our regular Berkeley Buddhist Monastery online programs, but we've been talking about doing Bathing Buddha online because yesterday was Shakyamuni Buddha's birthday, and we've been getting requests that some people really look forward to this event in the monasteries, and because of COVID-19
That'd be
and
great.
shelter in place, they can't come. So we're thinking of not doing it this Saturday because it's a bit of a rush, but we'll do it the following Saturday. I think it's May 9th, Saturday, May 9th. We're actually planning on doing it very early in the morning, so you have to get up early here in California at 6:30 a.m. to 7:30 a.m. The reason is because that actually also works for those in China. I think they're about 9:30 to 10:30. And
In
also
the evening?
in the evening, and also in Europe, which I believe is like Poland is 3:30 to 4:30. Yeah, so people can from a worldwide all participate
Even
together.
Australia.
Even Australia is 11:30 p.m. So Reverend Heng Sure is actually going to call in and give a little talk. And so we were
Good.
thinking that we were going to have a little form that people can sign in and they can write their name down. So one of the monks will actually bathe the Buddha for you, bathe the Buddha on behalf of, Dr. Martin Verhoeven. And then we were saying maybe you could bow at home as to kind of signify when we're bathing the Buddha, so you have active participation. But this is our hopes that people can, although it's this sheltered in place time, you still can bathe the Buddha and kind of renew ourselves and kind of clean our filth away and find our
I
Buddha nature.
really like this thought, because if you think about what's going on now, there's different contemplations over the centuries of bathing the Buddha, but this particular time we're living in, it's almost like an urgent need we have to bathe and renew, to cleanse. Not just the virus, which is symptomatic of a virus of the mind, of the spirit. So this becomes a very symbolic event of hope, of renewal, of re-nurturing, cleaning the water and the air. I mean, there's all kinds of contemplations you can do at this particular time. Because obviously the Buddha doesn't need to be bathed. It's symbolic, right? It's symbolic of us bathing ourselves and bathing our planet. So yeah, it's a really good, glad you're doing that.
Okay.
So when is it, May 9th?
May 9th, right? That's Saturday, right, Block? May 9th? You check your phone? Yeah, May 9th. So May 9th, Saturday, 6:30 to 7:30 a.m. It'll be on Dharma Realm Live, and also it'll be on Zoom, our regular channel. And you should be getting information about that soon. So it'll be on our website very soon. Okay, other than that, all our regular programs are still going. Reverend Heng Sure will be giving his Avatamsaka lecture tomorrow night, so please join. I think
Which is Sunday night in Australia, right?
Sunday,
Okay. We'll do the transference.
Put this in front of us. Sound be better. May every living being, our minds as one and radiant with light, share the fruits of peace with hearts of goodness, luminous and bright. If people hear and see how hands and hearts can find in giving unity, may our minds awake to great compassion, wisdom, and to joy. May kindness find reward. May all who sorrow leave their grief and pain. May this boundless light dispel the darkness of our endless night. Because our hearts are one, this world of pain turns into paradise. May all become compassionate and wise. May all become compassionate and wise. Bow in respect to the three jewels.